I was 32 when I decided to take a break from my job in Lyon. I'd been working in IT for almost a decade, spending my days behind screens and my nights trying to sleep off the artificial blue light burned into my eyes. Everything was fast, everything was loud. I didn't hate my job, but it had this quiet way of draining me in pieces. So, when my cousin offered me the chance to use a family-owned cabin for a few days out in the countryside, I didn't think twice. He said it was isolated and mostly unused since their grandfather passed away. No Wi-Fi, barely any cell reception, and surrounded by woods. That sounded perfect to me. The cabin was just outside a little town called Pont-de-Salles, tucked into the hills of southern France. It was October 2023, and the weather was already turning wet and cold. I packed light, just a duffel bag with clothes, a few meals, my camping knife, a flashlight, and a basic first aid kit. I brought some books too. Nothing fancy. Mostly old paperbacks I never got around to finishing. The drive from Lyon was long, almost 6 hours. As I left the highway and got deeper into the countryside, the roads narrowed and twisted. Trees hugged both sides like they wanted to reach across and touch each other. Clouds hung low in the sky, thick and unmoving. By the time I pulled into the gravel drive leading up to the cabin, it had started to drizzle. The place looked like something out of the early 1900s. One floor with paneling gone silver with age, a sloped tin roof that rattled when the wind pushed too hard. The porch sagged slightly, but it held my weight. I unlocked the door using the key hidden under a loose rock by the steps, and the inside greeted me with cold, musty air. The furniture was simple: one couch, one wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bed pushed into the corner. The place smelled like dust and wet wood. Still, it was quiet. That's all I cared about. The first day was uneventful. I settled in, walked around the woods for an hour or so, made a can of soup for dinner, and read until I passed out under the weight of silence. The sound of the rain tapping on the roof kept me asleep like a lullaby. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. The rain picked up that evening. Not a storm, but heavy and steady enough to drown out every other sound. I was sitting at the table, reading a travelogue about someone biking across Europe, when I felt something, maybe not heard, but felt, like a shift in pressure or presence. I looked up from the book. Through the cabin window, the trees were just barely visible, blurred and dark behind the glass. I told myself I was imagining things. Rain had a way of playing tricks on your hearing. It made distant sounds feel close and familiar ones seem foreign. Still, I went to the window and peered out. Nothing, just wet trees and darkness. Around 10 that night, I decided to go to bed. The cabin only had one bedroom, and even that was a stretch. It was more like a curtained-off corner with a mattress and a squeaky frame. I tucked myself in, knife on the nightstand, flashlight within reach, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy this time. I kept hearing something, soft thumps, like footsteps but not quite. More like damp weight shifting on wood. Every time I sat up and listened, it stopped. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe the wood swelling with the moisture. Maybe branches falling onto the roof. Maybe even a raccoon or stray dog outside. Still, I didn't feel right. My gut wasn't settled. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the sound again, clearer this time, right outside the cabin wall. A slow, dragging step, followed by silence, then another. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then I reached over, grabbed the flashlight, and clicked it on. I didn't point it outside. I didn't want to draw attention. I just waited. Nothing. Minutes passed, maybe half an hour. I heard nothing else. Eventually, the rain softened, and I managed to fall asleep from pure exhaustion. When I woke up the next morning, everything felt normal again. The rain had stopped. The forest smelled alive. I went outside and circled the cabin, half laughing at myself. But when I got to the back of the cabin, I saw something that killed the laughter in my throat. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Human. Wide apart like the person had been staggering. The mud had preserved them well. They led from the tree line to the back wall of the cabin, then disappeared under the window. The same window next to my bed. No prince leading away. My mind raced. Maybe some drunk from the village? But who walks barefoot through woods and mud to peer into a stranger's cabin? And where the hell did they go? I didn't have cell service to call anyone. I walked around with the flashlight and the knife the rest of that day. I kept checking the woods, thinking I'd see someone watching me, but I never did. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed up with the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. I kept the lights off and sat at the table, staring at the door, listening. Rain came again, heavier than before. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, and lightning flashed behind the trees. At one point, just past midnight, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a shadow that didn't match any branch or sway. I blinked and it was gone. I stayed frozen in that seat until the sun rose, exhausted but wired. When morning came, I went outside again. More footprints. There. Deeper this time, like the person had been running. This time they led from the woods to the porch, right up to the front door. And again, no prince walking back out. I was done. I started packing immediately, threw everything into the duffel, didn't bother folding anything. But I knew I had to walk to the main road, maybe 20 minutes downhill, to try and find signal. The rain had washed the road slick, and everything was gray and soupy. As I left the cabin, I felt that same pressure again. That weight of being watched, pressed down on me like a hand between my shoulders. I walked fast, but tried not to look like I was running. Every time I turned around, nothing was there. But that didn't mean I was alone. 10 minutes into the walk, I heard a branch snap behind me. Not just a crack, but a full snap, like weight had broken it. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking. Another crack, closer. My legs moved faster than I thought they could. The duffel bounced against my back. My knife was zipped inside, useless. I made it to the road, finally found a bar of signal and called the local gendarmes. My French isn't perfect, but I told them someone had been coming up to the cabin at night, watching me, walking barefoot, not speaking, not taking anything, just being there. They came out that afternoon. 2 officers. They found the prince too, said it could have been a local squatter, or maybe someone with mental issues. They didn't seem alarmed, but they offered to follow me back up and stay while I packed the rest of my things. I told them I already had everything. One of the officers asked if I wanted them to lock up the cabin. I told them to burn the damn thing down if they wanted. I stayed the night at a hotel in Rodez. I didn't sleep much there either, but at least I didn't hear anything. The next morning, I drove back to Lyon and never looked back. My cousin called a week later, told me the gendarmes checked the area but didn't find anyone. No squatters, no signs of a camp nearby, just the prince. I didn't tell him everything. Not about how the prince circled the cabin the third night. Not about how they were getting closer to the door each time. Not about the strange smell that came in through the cracks. Wet earth and something else, something sour. I didn't tell him that I'd seen a shape crouched behind the woodshed right before I left, low to the ground, unmoving, like it was waiting. I still work in IT, still live in the same apartment, but I don't camp anymore. I don't go out to the woods. I avoid places without cell service. And when it rains, sometimes I hear footsteps in my hallway, just soft enough to doubt myself. But I never doubt what I saw, and I never, ever go back to Ponte Salas. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo trip into the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. I was 31 back then, had just gone through a rough breakup, and needed to get away from everything. The city noise, work stress, all of it. I'd always loved the outdoors, especially places with some altitude and a bit of isolation. I wasn't looking for adventure, just some peace and maybe a little clarity. My plan was to rent out a remote hunting cabin deep in the forest for about a week. No cell service, no distractions, just time away to think and reset. The place I found was an old log cabin owned by a retired forest ranger who rented it out through a barely used website. It was about 10 miles from the nearest dirt road, accessible only by a rough ATV path that twisted through pine and aspen. I had a secondhand four-wheeler I'd bought years ago and finally had an excuse to use it for something real. The listing had a few blurry photos, log walls, a wood stove, a cot, and a little porch with a rusty metal chair. It didn't matter to me. All I needed was a roof over my head and a place far away from everything. I packed light. A few days' worth of canned food, a heavy-duty sleeping bag, my .45 just in case I ran into a bear or worse, a change of clothes, fire starter, and some water jugs. I brought a topo map of the area and an old compass my dad gave me when I was a kid. No GPS. I was trying to unplug completely. The drive to the trailhead was long, about 8 hours from Denver, winding through valleys and ridgelines that seemed to fold over themselves forever. The road eventually turned to gravel, then narrowed until it felt more like a deer path than anything built for humans. By the time I reached the place to leave my truck, it was mid-afternoon. I could see the sun slipping behind the ridge, and I didn't want to waste time. I loaded up the four-wheeler, strapped everything down, and started up the path. The climb was steep in places and almost too narrow for the quad. I had to slow down and check the map every half mile just to make sure I wasn't veering off. The trees were thick, and the canopy overhead blocked most of the light. It felt like the forest was leaning in on me. It took about 45 minutes to get to the cabin. The place was even more run down than I expected. Logs darkened with age, moss growing around the base, and the tin roof had a slight sag to it. The door creaked open with a hard shove. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust, but it was dry and solid. There was one small window, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a rickety table with 2 chairs. Against the far wall was a cot with a thin mattress and a pile of old wool blankets. I unpacked, cracked a can of chili, and started a small fire in the stove. It warmed the place up quickly, even with the gaps in the window frame. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch after the sun went down, listening to the night. It was quiet. No cars, no buzzing phones, just wind through the trees and the occasional branch snapping somewhere out there in the woods. It was the second night when things started to feel off. I'd been hiking earlier in the day, following a dry creek bed a mile or 2 north of the cabin. On the way back, I saw something that didn't sit right with me. At first I thought it was a coyote. It was trotting along the ridge above me, maybe 50 yards off, keeping pace. But when I stopped, it stopped. When I kept walking, it did too. I watched it through the trees for a while. The way it moved wasn't quite right. Coyotes move in a kind of light, quick rhythm, but this thing was slower, steadier, almost like it was walking on 2 legs but bent low. I couldn't be sure. The trees made it hard to see clearly. After a while, it disappeared into the brush, and I didn't think much of it. Back at the cabin, I sat on the porch again as night fell. The air was colder, and a light wind had picked up. I had the .45 on my lap, not because I was scared, but just because I didn't like how that thing had followed me. I told myself it was just some animal being curious. Around midnight, I woke up to a scraping sound outside. I'd left the fire burning low, so the room had a faint orange glow. I sat up and held my breath. The sound was like something brushing against the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I picked up the pistol and crept to the window. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just trees and black space. The next morning, I found long, thin scratches down one side of the cabin, near the back. Not deep, but visible. Could have been from a branch in the wind, but they weren't random. They ran parallel, maybe a dozen of them, all about the same length. I walked the perimeter with my gun drawn, checking for tracks, but the ground was too hard and dry. That afternoon, I went further out. I wanted to clear my head, maybe prove to myself that I wasn't letting isolation get to me. I hiked up to a ridge about 2 miles west and took in the view. The forest stretched out for miles, nothing but green slopes, jagged rock, and sky. On the way back, I saw movement again. This time I was sure it wasn't a normal animal. It was crouched low, maybe 30 yards ahead, near a dead tree. I froze. It was human-shaped but covered in what looked like fur or rags. Its limbs were too long, and it tilted its head in a jerky, unnatural way when it noticed me. I lifted the pistol and pointed it, not because I planned to shoot, but because I didn't know what else to do. The thing stayed crouched for a second, then darted into the trees. I waited there for nearly 10 minutes before I moved again. Every step back to the cabin felt like something was behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I blocked the door with the table and kept the gun beside me. Around 3 a.m., I heard movement again, this time on the porch. The boards creaked under something heavy. Then silence. I didn't go to the window. I didn't move. I just stayed there until dawn, muscles locked, listening. When the sun came up, I checked the porch. More scratches. A tuft of brown hair stuck in the corner of the doorway. It wasn't animal fur, not thick or soft. It was coarse, almost like human hair. That was it for me. I packed everything by noon, loaded up the quad, and got ready to leave. I felt exposed riding down that trail like something was just behind the trees watching. But I didn't go home yet. I stopped in the small town about an hour from the trailhead, parked the quad, and went to a local cafe. I needed to be around people, noise, movement. The waitress asked if I was okay. I must have looked like hell. I just said I'd had a rough night in the woods. After I finished eating, I talked to a guy outside who looked like a local. I didn't say exactly what I saw, just that something was out there near the old ranger's cabin. His face changed. He didn't say anything for a second, then told me he knew the area and that I probably wasn't the first person to come out shaken. He said some folks used to talk about things in those woods. Animals that weren't quite animals, people who lived off the land too long and went strange. He didn't elaborate, just told me it's best not to be alone out there. I drove back to Denver that night, windows down, trying to shake the feeling that I'd brought something with me. I checked the rearview mirror more than I should have. At every rest stop, I kept the pistol close. It's been years since that trip. I haven't been back to the San Juans, and I never will. I still hike and camp sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods. I don't talk about it much, because there's no way to say it without sounding crazy. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't some fairy tale creature. It was something real, something or someone that doesn't want to be found, and doesn't like when people get too close. I don't know if it was trying to scare me off, or if I just caught it by mistake. But whatever it wasn't a coyote, and it sure as hell wasn't a person in a costume. I've still got the map from that trip. Sometimes I take it out and trace the trail I took to the cabin. The hair I found on the porch, I saved it in a plastic bag, shoved in the back of a drawer. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe part of me still wants proof, something to hold in my hand when the memory doesn't feel real anymore. But the truth is, I don't need it. I remember every second of that trip like it just happened yesterday, and I know better than to ever go back. The cabin stood quietly in the middle of the forest, a lone structure tucked away from the bustle of the world. I had been here for 3 days, spending time alone after a long stretch of work. At first, the peace was almost overwhelming. Just the wind through the trees, the rustling leaves, and the occasional bird call. It was the kind of isolation that let you breathe again, think without the constant hum of life demanding your attention. I had driven up to the cabin in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the journey long but scenic. A short getaway for me, a 30-year-old tech worker, needing to disconnect and recharge before the inevitable grind of another year began. The cabin was simple, small, and rustic, a perfect spot to escape. No internet, no phone signal, just the bare essentials. A wood stove, a comfortable bed, and an old-fashioned outhouse. The sort of place that made you feel like you were returning to a time when things weren't so complicated. I spent my days hiking through the surrounding woods, gathering firewood, and cooking simple meals over the stove. Felt good to be away from everything, but by the third day, something began to change. The silence, once comforting, began to feel heavy. The first odd thing happened that morning. I woke up, early as usual, with the sun barely cresting over the horizon. I'd gotten into the habit of waking early to catch the morning light, the stillness of the world just before the day began. I got up, made my coffee, and went outside to sit on the porch. The cool air bit at my skin, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs. That's when I noticed something. A footprint, a boot print in the dirt just outside the porch. It wasn't large, but it was fresh, disturbingly so. It was too clear to have been there long, and it was too close to the cabin to be accidental. My heart skipped a beat. I had been alone here for days. No one had come by. I checked the rest of the area, nothing. No other signs, no disturbed ground, no tracks leading anywhere. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. A large animal with an oddly human-shaped print. I couldn't explain why the idea of another person being nearby unsettled me so much. There was no one for miles, or so I thought. I spent the rest of the morning keeping to the cabin, trying not to think too much about the print. The day passed, uneventfully, and by evening, the thought of it had almost faded from my mind. I sat by the fire that night, cooking a simple stew, the warmth from the flames soothing my nerves. The night was deep, the forest outside quiet. I settled into bed, thinking nothing more of the print. But then the noises began. At first, it was just a small sound, something light tapping against the wood. I figured it was the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the cabin. But as the hours passed, the sound grew louder. Steady, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the wall near the window. I tried to ignore it. I pulled the covers up, rolled over, and buried my head under the pillow. But it wouldn't stop. I finally had to get up, my feet cold against the wood floor as I moved toward the window. I peered out into the dark. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. I went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily that night. The tapping, which had stopped after I'd looked outside, lingered in my mind, and I found myself straining for any other sounds. Morning came, and though I felt uneasy, I got up and went about my day. I tried to shake off the lingering thoughts of the tapping, telling myself it was just the wind. But I kept noticing small things, the way the air felt too still, the quiet hum of the forest seeming off-key somehow. The second oddity came when I went to gather firewood that afternoon. I had found a decent stash of logs nearby, just off the main trail. I knew the area well from the last few days, but when I arrived at the usual spot, I noticed something else. Someone had been there before me. The logs had been disturbed, scattered as though someone had recently used them. The tracks were there again, clearer this time. 2 boot prints, side by side, leading into the forest. My stomach dropped. I knew I was alone. There was no one else around. I felt the sudden urge to leave, to pack up and drive back to the nearest town. But I couldn't. Something was holding me there. Fear? Curiosity? Couldn't say. I went back to the cabin, my mind racing. I checked the windows, the door locks, the small wooden chest where I kept the tools and supplies. Everything seemed fine, but the unease wouldn't leave. Night fell again, and with it, the same strange sense of being watched. I tried to push through it, cooked a meal, and settled by the fire. The wind howled outside, the trees swaying as though trying to reach the cabin, pulling at the edges of my nerves. But then came the sound. That same tapping, but louder now, more insistent. This time I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight and walked to the window. The night was pitch black outside, save for the beam of light I shone through the glass. Nothing, no sign of anyone. But as I scanned the trees, I saw something. A shape, barely visible, moving in the distance. My heart pounded in my chest. Was it a person or something else? Couldn't tell. The figure seemed to move between the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. It was too far to make out, too quick to track. But there was no doubt. Someone or something was out there. I locked the door and sat in the corner, trying to stay calm, trying to think logically. There was no phone service. There were no neighbors for miles. The only option was to wait until morning. I spent the night in a half-sleep, every small sound making me jump, every creak of the cabin floor setting my nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, I couldn't wait any longer. I packed up my things, moving quickly, trying to stay focused. The unease from the past few days had grown unbearable. The thought of staying even one more night made my skin crawl. As I loaded my car, I noticed something else. The boot prints were still there, the same tracks that had appeared on the first day. But now they were closer, almost like they were leading toward the cabin. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and drove out of there as fast as I could. The road was bumpy, winding, and I barely looked back as I left. The cabin, the strange prints, the tapping, all of it was behind me now. I didn't know who or what had been out there or why it had felt so off, but I wasn't going to find out. The peace I had come looking for was nowhere to be found. It was a good thing, though. The thought of another night in that cabin was enough to convince me it wasn't just isolation I needed. It was distance. As I drove down the mountain, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't know if I'd ever return to that cabin, but I knew one thing for sure. Some places were better left alone. It was the kind of weekend I had been longing for. Peace, quiet, and solitude. A break from the world and from the grind of daily life. My name is Kyle, and I'm a 32-year-old man from a small town in New Mexico. I had always been fond of the outdoors, of hiking and camping, and had decided to rent a small, secluded cabin for the weekend. The idea was simple: get away from everything, clear my mind, and recharge my batteries. The cabin was tucked deep in the pine forests of the Santa Fe National Forest, far away from the nearest town. I had found it online. Pictures of it were rustic and charming, nestled by a small creek with a porch that looked out onto miles of untouched wilderness. It looked perfect. The cabin owner, a guy named Tom, had been friendly when I called to arrange the booking. He told me it was an old family cabin and that I'd have everything I needed, including firewood and a stocked fridge. I arrived late on Friday afternoon, the sun still hanging low in the sky. The cabin was exactly as advertised. A small, one-story building with a slanted roof and dark wooden siding. There were large windows in the front, showing the dense trees beyond. The whole place exuded an old-world charm, like it had been standing for decades, though it was well-maintained. There was a small wooden deck with a couple of chairs that I immediately sat in, soaking in the fresh, crisp air of the forest. I stepped inside, dropped my backpack by the door, and took in the smell of pine and wood. There was a living room with a stone fireplace, an old armchair near the window, and a small kitchen off to the side. A stairwell led up to the loft, which contained a bed and a small sitting area. The place was cozy, perfect for one person, and felt just isolated enough to give me the kind of solitude I needed. The first night went by without incident. I lit a fire in the fireplace and spent a few hours reading, enjoying the warmth and comfort. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The only sound aside from the crackling of the fire was the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. It felt good to be away from the city. Around 11 p.m., I decided to head to bed. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I made my way up to the loft. The bed was a simple mattress with clean linens, and I sank into it, closing my eyes and drifting off quickly. There were no noises, no disturbances, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I woke up in the middle of the night to an odd sound. It was a faint scratching noise, like something was dragging along the outside of the cabin. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just a branch swaying in the wind or some small animal moving around. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I got up, pulled on my boots, and grabbed a flashlight. I made my way down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I opened the door, the night air hit me like a wave of cold water. I shone the flashlight out into the darkness, scanning the area around the cabin. Nothing. The light bounced off the trees and underbrush, but there was no sign of movement. I stood there for a moment, listening. The only sound I could hear was the wind, rustling through the leaves. I figured it was just a critter, maybe a raccoon or something, and decided to go back inside. But as I stepped back through the door, I froze. The door had been left ajar. I was certain I had closed it behind me. My stomach dropped as I realized something wasn't right. I stepped cautiously inside, looking around. Everything seemed normal, but a sudden chill ran through me. Something felt off. I checked the locks on the windows and doors, all of which were secure. Still, a feeling of unease settled over me as I went back upstairs to bed. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't get back to sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the forest. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee. I made my way downstairs and found that someone had already started a fire in the stove. For a moment, I froze, my mind racing. Who else was in the cabin? I checked the other rooms, but they were empty. No sign of anyone. I called Tom, the cabin owner, but his phone went straight to voicemail. It was strange. I had rented the place by myself, and there was no mention of anyone else staying here. The oddities kept adding up. Noises in the night, the door left open. It felt as though someone had been here, and they didn't want to be noticed. I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. Maybe it was all in my mind, the stress of the city catching up with me. The hike took me deeper into the woods, and I found a small clearing near a stream. It was peaceful, the sound of water running over rocks soothing in a way I hadn't expected. I sat down on a log, trying to relax. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud, large boots with deep tread marks. They were heading towards the cabin. I didn't know what to think. Had someone been following me? Felt impossible, yet the evidence was clear. I spent the next few hours walking back and forth, trying to figure out what to do. The sun was beginning to set, and I didn't want to be outside after dark. As I made my way back to the cabin, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced someone was watching me. When I returned, everything seemed normal, but I didn't trust it. I double-checked the locks again, made sure everything was secure. I decided to sleep downstairs on the couch that night, not wanting to be alone in the loft. My nerves were shot, but I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no real danger. It was just the isolation getting to me. But then I heard it again, the scratching noise. It was faint, but this time it was coming from the roof. I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tight as I climbed out the back door. I aimed the light upwards, scanning the roof. There was nothing there. I circled the cabin, shining the beam of light at the edges of the roof, but it was all clear. The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the trees, and the noise stopped. I felt foolish for being so paranoid, but there was a part of me that still wasn't convinced. My mind raced with thoughts of someone watching, someone sneaking around. That night, I set up a camera inside the cabin, aiming it towards the door. I was determined to figure out what was going on. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. My mind wouldn't shut off. I kept picturing the footprints, the strange sounds, and the feeling that someone was out there, lurking just beyond my view. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, this time louder. The unmistakable sound of someone walking around outside. It was clear now. Someone was out there, and they weren't trying to be quiet. I grabbed the camera footage and watched it on my phone. To my horror, I saw a shadow move past the front door. A figure, tall and gaunt, walked across the porch. My heart raced as I replayed it over and over. There was no mistake, it was real. I ran outside with my flashlight, scanning the area. My breath came in short bursts, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me all along. I decided to leave. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and locked the cabin one last time. As I walked to my truck, I glanced back at the cabin, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in the window, a face staring out at me from the shadows. I didn't look back after that. I got in my truck and drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. The eerie feeling of being watched never left me, and I couldn't shake the image of that face in the window. When I finally got home, I contacted Tom again. This time, he answered. He was apologetic, explaining that the cabin had been a family property for generations, and sometimes distant relatives came to check on it. But no one had been there during my stay, he assured me. I didn't believe him. The camera footage disappeared the next day, erased without a trace, as if it had never existed. I never went back to that cabin. The cabin stood in the middle of nowhere, as I expected, and for a moment, I was taken aback by its rough appearance. It was a far cry from the glossy brochures I'd seen online. The wood was weathered and cracked, the roof sagging in places, and the porch was lined with overgrown weeds. Yet there it was. It had been years since I'd gone camping, much less stayed at a remote cabin like this. My name's Earl, and I'm 65 years old now. I've lived through a lot, but lately, I've been feeling the weight of it all, like my time's running out. The doctor said I needed to get out more. "Spend some time in nature, Earl," he said. "You'll feel better." I figured a weekend at this cabin, just outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, would be a good way to get away from the city, the noise, and the constant rush of life. I'm not much of a city guy, but after losing my wife, Ruth, a year ago, I found it hard to find peace. My kids are all grown up, scattered across the country, and they don't call much. I thought a little solitude might do me some good. I'd rented the cabin for the weekend. The drive had been long, but it had given me time to think. I didn't mind the isolation at first. It gave me time to clear my head. But now, standing on the porch and looking out at the barren stretch of desert that surrounded the cabin, I was beginning to doubt my decision. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked inside. The air was cool, with a hint of dust. The cabin smelled old, like pine and something musty that hadn't been aired out in too long. The furniture was basic. An old wooden chair by the window, a small table, and a worn-out couch that looked like it belonged to another era. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, the kind you'd see in a hunting lodge, and the walls were lined with photographs of landscapes, animals, and people I didn't recognize. I could tell they were taken by someone who had spent their whole life in the wild, people who knew how to live off the land. The cabin was more or less what I expected, but I felt a sense of discomfort creeping in. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the way the place seemed to have been left behind, forgotten by time. I tossed my bag onto the bed in the corner and went about setting up my things. It wasn't long before I heard a noise outside. I froze, listening. It sounded like a car engine, a muffled hum coming from the distance, faint at first but growing louder. I stood by the window and looked out, half expecting to see a truck or some kind of vehicle coming down the dirt road. But the landscape remained quiet. No one in sight. It struck me as strange. The cabin was supposed to be secluded. The nearest neighbor, according to the website, was miles away. I'd seen no signs of life when I arrived. I shook it off. Probably just someone passing through, I thought. Could be a delivery or someone who had been out hunting. I went back to unpacking, but the thought nagged at me. What if someone had come to check on the place? I didn't know what time it was, but I could tell the sun was setting. The sky turned a deep orange, painting the horizon in a way that felt almost surreal, the kind of sunset you only get in the desert. I decided to take a walk before it got dark, stretch my legs. The cabin had a small yard, and beyond that, nothing but miles of scrub and rocks. I stepped outside, the dry air biting at my skin. I headed down the dirt path that led away from the cabin. I could feel the crunch of gravel under my boots, the only sound apart from the faint rustle of wind. The road ahead stretched out into the vast emptiness, and the only thing in sight was a line of distant hills. There was no one around, no sign of anyone, not even the faintest trace of a vehicle. But then I saw it, a figure. It was far off, barely visible against the twilight sky, standing still near a cluster of cacti. I stopped in my tracks. The figure seemed out of place, not just for the time of day, but for the way it stood. It didn't seem like someone just passing by. It was too still, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to make out the details, but the distance made it hard to see clearly. Whoever it was, they weren't moving. I should have turned around, gone back inside, locked the door, and waited for morning, but I didn't. I found myself walking toward the figure, drawn by some kind of curiosity, or maybe it was just foolishness. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't seem to be wearing proper clothing for a desert evening. It was dressed in dark, heavy clothes, almost like a coat or jacket, despite the heat. And the longer I looked, the more I realized the figure wasn't just standing there. It was watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't sure why, But something about this didn't sit right. It wasn't just the oddness of the situation. It was the feeling of being watched, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't. I took another step forward, but my heart was racing now, the pulse in my ears deafening. My instincts told me to turn around, to get back to the cabin as fast as I could. But before I could make a decision, the figure shifted. It wasn't a quick movement, just a subtle change, but it was enough to make me freeze. It took a step forward, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't see its face. The figure was too far away, and the dusk was deepening fast. But I could sense its eyes on me, cold, unblinking. I felt like a fool for not bringing my phone with me. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't reach anyone. The figure began to move again, slowly now, like it was coming toward me. I turned around and started walking back to the cabin, faster now, my legs carrying me with a speed that surprised me for my age. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the cabin keys. My pulse was pounding in my ears. By the time I reached the door, I could hear the crunch of footsteps behind me. Not far, but close enough. My heart thudded against my chest. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against it, breathless. I stood there in the dim cabin, the sound of my breathing the only thing I could hear. For a few minutes, I just stood there, not daring to move. I looked through the small window by the door but saw nothing. Nothing but the darkening desert. I didn't know what to do. The footsteps, the figure, it all felt wrong. I couldn't tell if it was just some stranger wandering the area or if it was something more sinister. There was a gnawing feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away, like something terrible was about to happen. I had been alone for too long. Maybe it was just my age, my mind playing tricks on me. I turned to the fireplace and started a small fire. It was a comfort, at least. I needed something to distract me from the panic that was threatening to consume me. I kept the lights low, not wanting to draw attention to the cabin. Hours passed, but I didn't hear anything more. The night was unnervingly quiet. I managed to calm myself, convincing myself I had overreacted. The figure could have been a hiker, maybe someone who lived nearby, though I didn't know where exactly that would be. The desert stretched for miles in every direction, and there was no way to know if anyone else was out here. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch, exhaustion overtaking my senses. But it was a restless sleep, filled with half-dreams of someone standing over me in the dark. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was high, and the desert looked peaceful again. The events of the previous night seemed almost like a bad dream, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. I spent the next couple of hours packing up and getting ready to leave. My heart wasn't in the trip anymore. The feeling of being watched, of something being wrong, had stayed with me. I didn't want to risk staying another night. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange near the edge of the porch, a dark stain on the ground. It was too much to ignore now. There had been a sign, something I missed before, something that made me realize I wasn't imagining things. The stain was fresh, footprints leading away from the cabin, toward the cacti, disappearing into the desert. They were big, heavy prints. I didn't wait to investigate. I just left, fast. I made it back to Santa Fe that afternoon, and when I checked into a motel, I was shaken but relieved. The cabin wasn't what I thought it would be. I've been to a lot of places in my life, but this felt wrong. That night, back at the motel, I checked my phone. There had been a news report about a missing hiker in the area. A man, last seen near the desert. I didn't need to know more. I'd had enough. Maybe I'm getting too old for this kind of thing. The next morning, I left Santa Fe and didn't look back. That cabin was nothing but a bad memory. I'll never go back. I was 36 when it happened. My name is Dan, and my wife Laura was 34 back then. We had been married for 7 years, no kids, and both of us had decent jobs in Columbus, Ohio. She worked in property management, and I was doing maintenance for a school district. We'd taken vacations before, the usual ones, Cancun, Lake Erie, Smoky Mountains, but nothing ever felt truly quiet. There was always some rush or some distraction. In late October of 2021, I decided we needed to get away from everything. It wasn't something we had really talked about before, but I had started feeling a pressure in my chest every time we got into a routine. It felt like we were always checking our phones, always working or making plans. So I suggested a full week in a quiet, private cabin. Just us, no internet, no neighbors, deep in the woods. She liked the idea more than I expected. I booked a cabin about an hour outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I found it through a listing on a small vacation site, not one of the big ones. It was a private owner, and the cabin looked solid in the pictures. 2 stories, dark wood exterior, no other homes within a few miles. It was set back in the woods down a gravel road. The owner said in the listing that cell service was weak at best, and there was no Wi-Fi. Perfect. We left early Saturday morning and got there around 3 in the afternoon. It was a little colder than I thought it would be. Mid-40s, some light wind, fallen leaves covering the gravel path like a thick rug. The drive up to the cabin took about 10 minutes once we left the main road. The gravel road narrowed, winding through trees that pressed in on both sides. The deeper we drove, the more we felt like the world was fading away behind us. When we pulled up to the cabin, it was even more remote than I had imagined. The clearing around it was about half an acre, with tall trees surrounding the space like a natural wall. There was a small wooden deck on the front, a fire pit off to the left, and some chopped firewood stacked near the side of the house. The air smelled like pine and cold dirt. No cars, no people, just trees and that soft rustling sound of wind through dry leaves. The first night was peaceful. We cooked some steaks on a little propane grill that came with the place, drank wine, and sat by the fire pit. The silence out there was thick. You could hear everything. A branch snapping felt like a gunshot. The sound of a raccoon rummaging through leaves was enough to make your heart jump. But we liked it. We wanted to feel far away. Inside, the cabin was simple. One large open room on the bottom floor with a couch, small kitchen, dining table, and a bathroom in the back. Upstairs was a single loft-style bedroom with a window that looked out over the front clearing. The walls were wood-paneled, and the heat came from an old propane furnace and a small fireplace. No TV, no clocks, just some books, board games, and silence. On the second night, we were sitting near the fire pit again, just watching the flames and listening to the wind pick up. It had gotten colder, maybe in the high 30s. The wind would push through the trees in waves, making them bend and creak like they were alive. Around 10 p.m., we heard what sounded like footsteps coming from deeper in the woods behind the cabin. I froze for a second, but Laura laughed nervously and said it was probably a deer. I agreed, probably was. But something about the pattern of the sound, slow, spaced apart, felt off. Not fast like a running animal, more like careful steps. Still, we let it go and went inside. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. Around 2:30 a.m., I thought I heard the sound of gravel shifting near the front porch. Not loud, just enough to make me sit up. I stared at the window for a while but didn't see anything. The moonlight was filtering through the trees, casting soft shadows that moved just enough to mess with your eyes. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next morning, I checked the front porch and the gravel around it. Nothing stood out. No footprints, no marks, just dry leaves and pebbles. Still, I felt uneasy. The cabin had one deadbolt on the front door and a small wooden latch on the back. No security system, no cameras. That's what we had wanted, but now it made me feel exposed. I didn't say anything to Laura. I didn't want to freak her out over nothing. That day, we hiked a bit around the property. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that curved around a small hill and eventually looped back to the gravel road. Along the way, we saw a few old tree stands and a rusted-out trailer half sunk into the ground, probably abandoned for decades. It was empty inside. No furniture, no belongings, just cracked wood and mold growing on the inside walls. Creeped Laura out, so we kept walking. We spent that afternoon reading on the front deck. Laura was wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping coffee, and I was half asleep in one of the deck chairs when I heard the sound of movement again, this time off to the right, deeper in the woods. It was fast, like someone walking and then ducking down. I looked over, but again, saw nothing, just trees and shadows. Later that evening, We brought some firewood inside and started up the fireplace. Around 9 p.m., I went outside to grab some things from the car. That's when I noticed something weird. On the driver's side door, down near the bottom, there was a long scratch. It wasn't there before. It looked like someone had taken a rock or key and dragged it across the paint. My heart thudded, and I looked around. The woods were dark. I couldn't see more than 10 feet past the edge of the clearing. I went inside and told Laura that maybe a branch had fallen on the car or a raccoon had scratched it. She didn't question it much. We played cards, drank a little bourbon, and tried to relax. But I kept thinking about that sound I heard the night before. The gravel shifting, the footsteps in the woods, and now the scratch on the car. That night, I stayed up later than her. She went to bed around 11. I sat downstairs near the window, just listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of the cabin's back door handle turning slowly, then stopping, then turning again. Not fast, not aggressive, just slow and deliberate. I stayed completely still, breathing shallow, my eyes locked on the dark hallway that led to the back. Then it stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour. Nothing else happened. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear the door open. I finally got up, grabbed the fire poker from the fireplace, and crept toward the back. The door was shut. The latch was still in place, but the handle had dirt on it. Fresh dirt, smeared along the metal. Someone had touched it. I went upstairs and locked the bedroom door. I didn't tell Laura. I just lay there next to her, holding the fire poker, wide awake until morning. The next day, we didn't do much. I was too on edge. We stayed close to the cabin, cooked inside, and didn't talk much. Around 3 p.m., I walked the property again, trying to find anything out of place. About 40 yards into the woods behind the cabin, I found a small pile of trash, an old cigarette pack, a torn beer can, and a thin rope bundled up. It looked fresh, not weathered by rain or wind. Someone had been there. When I got back, I took one of the dining chairs and wedged it under the front door handle. I moved a small table against the back door. Laura asked if I was okay. I told her I was just being careful. That night, I didn't sleep at all. At 2:15 a.m., I heard something again, this time on the roof. Soft, slow steps. They moved from one end of the roof to the other, paused, then back again. I stared at the ceiling like I could see through it. I could hear the soft creak of the wooden beams flexing under weight. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a raccoon or squirrel. It was someone walking. I sat up, held the fire poker again, and waited. After a while, it stopped. Silence returned, but I never went back to sleep. The final night was the worst. We had already decided we were leaving a day early. I didn't care about the money we'd lose. I just wanted to get out of there. We packed most of our things, and I parked the car closer to the front steps. That night, we stayed downstairs on the couch with the fire going. I kept the poker next to me and the biggest kitchen knife I could find tucked under my leg. Around midnight, we heard it. A single knock on the back door. Just one. Then silence. My heart was hammering in my chest. I stood up slowly, motioned to Laura to stay put, and crept toward the back. I didn't turn the lights on. I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. Then another knock. This time softer, like they were testing me. I waited there for 20 minutes, not moving. Eventually, I slid the table aside, unlatched the door, and flung it open with the poker raised high. No one was there, but right at the edge of the clearing, just before the trees swallowed the light, I saw a man standing still, just barely visible, wearing dark clothes. No light, no flashlight, no movement, just standing there watching. I shut the door, locked it, moved the table back, and told Laura to get upstairs. We stayed locked in the bedroom until sunrise. I didn't sleep. I hadn't expected to end up here, not like this. My name's Jake, and I've been looking for a break for a while, somewhere far from the noise of the city. I was in my late 20s, not too young but still figuring things out, and had been working the same job in a small marketing firm for 3 years. The stress of deadlines, meetings, and endless emails was eating me alive. I needed silence, isolation, and something real, something genuine. I found an ad online for a cabin rental up in the woods of North Carolina, far enough off the beaten path to keep anyone from bothering me. It was affordable, which was a bonus, and the pictures made it look like something out of a dream. A wooden cabin nestled against a steep hill, surrounded by towering pines and a stream that snaked through the valley. The ideal escape. I packed light clothes, a couple of books, and some food to keep me going. The drive there took longer than expected. The road wound up through thick forests, the trees so close together it felt like I was entering another world. My car bounced over the uneven terrain, and my tires kicked up dust as I ventured further from civilization. The air was thick with the smell of pine, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the occasional bird call. I finally reached the cabin as the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the landscape. The cabin was everything I'd hoped for and more. It was built out of rough-hewn logs, with a small porch and a wide, high roof that slanted down to meet the ground in the back. The windows were simple, but there was something charming about the way the light filtered through the trees and bounced off the glass. The place looked well kept, the kind of place someone who genuinely cared for it would maintain. The front door creaked when I opened it, and the smell of old would hit me, musty but comforting. I spent the first evening unpacking, setting up a small fire in the stone fireplace, and getting comfortable. The evening passed slowly, and soon it was dark. I didn't mind the quiet. In fact, it felt like a relief. I had no plans, no agenda. Just the idea of doing nothing for a few days sounded perfect. The night was calm, but something about the silence felt too much. The wind didn't whistle through the trees like I thought it would, and the animals seemed distant. No rustling in the bushes, no sounds of critters scurrying through the leaves. It was unsettling, but I pushed it aside. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The next day, I woke up early to the sound of birds chirping outside. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool air brushing against my skin. The forest stretched out in every direction, a sea of green beneath the bright sky. The small stream that ran by the cabin gurgled softly, its waters clear and crisp. I spent the morning wandering around the area, just taking in the scenery. I found a small path leading up the hill behind the cabin and decided to follow it. The incline wasn't steep, but the ground was uneven with roots and rocks, making it a bit tricky to navigate. The trees grew closer together as I climbed higher, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches twisting above me. After a short hike, I reached a small clearing at the top of the hill. From here, I could see the valley below, the cabin now just a tiny dot in the distance, barely visible through the thick trees. The view was breathtaking. I stood there for a while, just looking out over the landscape, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The kind of peace that made me forget all the noise I had left behind. But then I noticed something strange. There was a faint smell in the air. Not the usual scent of pine or earth, but something else. Something metallic. I couldn't place it at first, but the further I stood there, the more it lingered. My stomach churned, and a wave of unease settled over me. I looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just trees. Yet the feeling wouldn't leave. It was like being watched. It wasn't the first time I had felt like this, but I'd never really paid attention before. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe I had been out here too long already. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling a little unsettled. The hike had been nice, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I made my way down the hill faster, eager to get back to the safety of the cabin. Later that evening, I decided to take the edge off with a drink. I made a small fire in the hearth, the crackling of the wood filling the silence. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees outside. I had a nice buzz going when I settled into the worn-out armchair by the fire, a book in hand. It wasn't long before the feeling came back, that same strange sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, but it grew more pronounced the longer I sat there. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving outside, branches snapping, the rustle of leaves. But when I looked, there was nothing. The forest was still. At around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I blew out the lanterns, and the room grew dark except for the soft glow of the dying fire. I had planned to get a full night's sleep, but the unease was still there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I lay in bed, trying to push it out of my mind. The sheets were warm, the cabin was quiet, but the air felt heavy. I couldn't help but listen for any sound outside, any sign that something was out there, but nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy but determined to enjoy the day. I decided to stay inside for most of the morning, reading and relaxing by the fire. But my mind kept returning to the events of the night before. The feeling of being watched, the strange scent in the air. Couldn't shake it no matter how hard I tried. Around noon, I decided to take a walk. I needed to clear my head, to stop thinking about whatever was bothering me. As I stepped outside, the air felt cooler than the day before. The forest seemed quieter too. I walked toward the stream, hoping the sound of running water would help calm my nerves. The stream was beautiful, its water flowing swiftly over the rocks. I knelt down to dip my fingers into the cool water, but something caught my eye on the opposite bank. It was a footprint, large and distinct, pressed into the muddy earth. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and took a step back, my mind racing. It was too big to be an animal's, but it didn't look like a human footprint either. The shape was all wrong. Too wide, too deep, and the distance between each step was odd. It didn't make sense. I scanned the area around the footprint, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I took a deep breath and decided to head back to the cabin. The unease from the previous night had returned, stronger than before. But as I reached the clearing near the cabin, I noticed something else. A car. A black SUV parked just off the dirt road, barely visible from the trees. I froze. No one had come up here, at least no one I had invited. The cabin was supposed to be remote. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I walked cautiously toward the vehicle, but the moment I got closer, I saw the driver's seat was empty. The door was slightly ajar, and there were signs that it had been there for some time. Dust on the windows, the wheels half sunken into the ground. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to grab my stuff and leave, but something told me to stay. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the need to confront whatever was out there. Either way, I decided to check around the cabin once more, looking for any signs of someone having been there. I found nothing. That evening, I locked all the doors and windows, deciding to leave the cabin the next morning. The car was still parked outside, but no one had come back to it. I sat by the fire, my nerves a wreck, listening to the sound of the wind outside and the occasional snap of a branch. But the night passed without incident. When the sun rose the next day, I was ready to leave. The feeling had lifted. I packed my things and went outside to check the SUV one last time. It was still there, but now it didn't seem as threatening. Maybe I had overthought everything. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me. I was about to get in my car when I heard a rustling from the woods. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned toward the sound, but it was just a deer, a small doe grazing in the clearing. I took a long, deep breath and smiled. Maybe I was just paranoid. The place was remote, yes, but it was peaceful too. I shook my head and decided to give the cabin another chance. I didn't want to let my fears control me. As I left the woods behind, I realized something. It wasn't just the quiet that had made me uneasy. It was the unknown. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what you can't.